Welcome to 13-7, writing equations of sine and cosine graphs. All right, when you do this, there's going to be some things that you're going to have to remember. We're going backwards. So the first thing you want to do is to identify the period. If we look at this graph, there's one complete cycle from 0 to pi. So the period is pi. Therefore, we know that 2 pi divided by b equals pi. So b must equal 2. That's going to be an important point to use on our equation. We also know the midline. The midline's the middle of the graph. Basically, it acts like the x-axis. If we look at the top value, 2, and the bottom value, -4, if we find the average of those 2 points, -1's the midline. That'll be another point or another value we need. We also can use the midline to find the amplitude. If we look at the midline of -1, we can see that from the midline, the amplitude would be 3, because 2 is the highest point, and from -1 to 2, it's a value of 3. So that's another value we're going to need for our equation. Now we're pretty much ready to write the equation of the graph. And I'm going to give you 4 different equations today to show you that we can write it as a sine function or a cosine function. And that's what you're going to do today. So if we write it as a sine function, and we're going to use different starting points, so I'm going to show you that. So if I want to use this point right here, we'll call it A, as my starting point, then my equation is going to be y equals 3, because that's the amplitude, sine 2, remember that's the b, parenthesis x minus pi over 4, because it shifted right pi over 4. I had a horizontal shift of pi over 4. And the vertical shift was down 1. Now one other thing we have to do is the sine function normally goes up. It starts at, the axis, this point right here, and goes up, but it's going down. So that's a reflection. So we have to put a negative out in front. Now if we wanted to do a different sine function, we could do a different starting point. And if we did a starting point, let's say back here at b, then what would change is we would have y equals 3 sine 2. Now we're shifting left, so it would be x plus pi over 4 minus 1. Notice everything's pretty much the same except for the horizontal shift and the fact that there's no negative out in front of the amplitude. Now if we want to change that idea and go to a cosine function, we could start right up here at c, and we could do a cosine function. So again, we have 3 for the amplitude, but now we're doing cosine 2. Now because we're starting on the y-axis, that's kind of no shift occurs, no horizontal shift occurs. So we just have 2x, and then we have a vertical shift of -1. We might want to put that -1 out in front, but as long as it's not in parentheses, we know. So we could do it that way, or if we want to be clear, we could put -1 plus 3 cosine 2x. That -1 means the same, whether it's at the very back end or at the front. Still a vertical shift. And let's do one more point. If we pick this point right over here, we'll call that D. Then we could do another cosine graph, because we're not starting on the midline, we're starting off the midline at a max or min. That's an indicator that it's a cosine. So if we're starting at D, we have 3 cosine 2. Notice everything's still the same. Parenthesis, we have a horizontal shift now of pi over 2 to the right, so we write minus pi over 2. We still have a vertical shift of -1, but the cosine normally starts up like it did in point C, but if we're going to use point D as our starting point, we have to use a negative. That's all I got for you today. Hopefully you can use that to work on the worksheet that I have handed out in class. Good luck.